These are a monthly panel discussions with experts featuring think tankers, journalists, academics, former government officials, now in the private sector to discuss all things Indo-Pacific, or right now with the way the world is going, Indo-Pacific with a West Asia twist. And we in our previous episodes we've tried to unpack the conflict in West Asia, the ramifications for South Asia and the broader Indo-Pacific region. We've explored how this escalating crisis is affecting broader strategic geopolitical considerations across the Indo-Pacific, the economic shocks, supply chain disruptions, energy crisis, and the shift in diplomatic alignments and the shifting sands. Since then, Truce talks and proposals have been exchanged. Progress has been stalled between Iranian and American negotiators. And for this discussion, we're going to talk about the current stalemate between US and Iran and where the chips fall, and Islamabad's gambit or gamble, and the energy implications for South Asia, because that's a big focus. And what happens with the Strait of Hormuz as this war continues or stalled right now. But to analyze all of this, I am delighted to be joined by an exceptional panel. New set of faces, but no strangers to any of you in Washington, D.C. or those who follow South Asia. Dr. Daniel Markey, Senior Fellow, South Asia Program at the Stimson Center. Tamanna Salikuddin, Adjunct Senior Fellow, Indo-Pacific Security Program at the Center for a New American Security, or CNAS. And Michael Kugelman, Resident Fellow at the Atlantic Council, all wearing new hats from their previous avatars. I'm Akshobh Giridharadas from USISPF, and just some housekeeping rules. These conversations are being recorded and live stream and also available on YouTube's platform right now or even later on. So I'm going to start with a few questions, but please feel free to send in your questions in the chat box and we'll try to get to as many as we can. So welcome to all three of you. Dan, I'm going to get you opening batsman, as we say in South Asia. Very good morning to you. You've
Morning.
studied South Asia and American strategy in South Asia, both as an academic and a policy practitioner in the State Department, and particularly on the US-Pakistan relationship. You literally wrote the book on it, right? No Exit from Pakistan, America's Tortured Relationship with Islamabad. So your publicist and I both will tell everyone it's a recommended read for everyone listening. But it's a funny relationship with US-Pakistan relations, right? Since Mumbai attacks of 26/11, 2008, and the Bin Laden raid and killing in 2011, no US president has visited Pakistan in nearly 2 decades, right? Maybe exactly 2 decades. We're going back to the Bush era. Now we saw Vice President J.D. Vance get a red carpet welcome. In fact, in your webinar at Stimson last week, you spoke about VP Vance being in the lobby of the Serena Hotel in Islamabad, not on anyone's 2026 bingo card. So reading the tea leaves or perhaps chai leaves. What's Islamabad doing right that Muscat, Doha couldn't do right in this larger diplomatic game?
It's a great question. And first, thanks for having me on the show. It's great to see you, great to see my fellow panelists, and to talk about this strange year and, as you say, a strange shift in Pakistan's place in the region and the world, and in particular in its relationship with the United States and its place in these talks on Iran. So why Pakistan? You sort of concluded with this question of why Pakistan and not, say, Qatar or Oman or others. Why should they be playing this role? And there are a bunch of different answers, but I think the ones that most people kind of come down on are one, a simple one, geography. It's literally right there. And it can provide and has provided a relatively secure way and means for the Iranians and their delegations to actually speak with the United States. And that's not nothing, especially in a hot war like this one, where you've seen attacks, including attacks on top Iranian leaders from the very start. And so to be able to say to Iran's negotiators, look, we can provide you a venue to meet with the Americans where you probably won't be attacked by the Israelis, that's a big deal. So that's number one. Of course, Pakistan has good ties with Iran, so that makes it eligible. Not every country in the world could say that, and so that puts it in the category. And Pakistan, I think it needs to be recognized, has really important national interests here, and so it's highly motivated to play a role. I think you mentioned energy issues, but that's just the start of it. I mean, it is a next door neighbor to Iran, so what happens there has the potential for spillover in lots of different ways. So Pakistan cares. And then, as you pointed out, Pakistan, in addition to being able to work with Iran, can also work with the United States, if not so much with Israel. And so that puts it in a running there. And then the last point would be its ties with Saudi Arabia. And here I think it's really important because Qatar, Oman, who may be able to work well with Iran, have somewhat more challenged relations with Saudi. whereas Pakistan has a close tie with Riyadh, particularly after their defense pact of late last year. And so that means that it can bring to the table not just all the other things, but a kind of a leverage in the relationship. I'm sure we'll get into that some more, but a leverage in the relationship that gives it some cachet with Riyadh, which in this particular conflict is also really important. So all those things make it eligible, put it in the right spot, in a sense, at the right time.
Thanks, Dan. And I think as you touched on the defense pact, I want to kind of unpack that a little bit, both Tamanna and Michael. So, Tamanna, I want to come to you. We were just reminiscing about your days in Islamabad at the embassy and your many years in Washington, working with the State Department on all things South Asia. Just jumping in on what Dan mentioned, we kind of unpack Pakistan's role here, because for many in New Delhi, India, and the rest of the world, they're flummoxed at seeing how Islamabad has reasserted its relevance as this sort of geopolitical intermediary. But in given that what we talked about not on anyone's 2026 bingo card, because even if you go back to 23, 24, there was economic morass, political troubles with former Prime Minister Imran Khan, and not so much great standing on the world stage. Pakistan's always in IMF's debt list. So how is Washington and the Trump administration looking at leveraging Islamabad in this crisis moment right now?
Thanks so much, Akshobh, and thank you to USIPF for having this discussion. It's very timely. I, of course, agree with everything Dan said, and I would just add some more context as to why Islamabad is particularly being leveraged by the Trump administration in this moment. I mean, I think this type of I would characterize this relationship is quite transactional between Washington and Islamabad, but that's par for the course. I think Pakistan is very used to a US-Pakistan relationship that has ups and downs. And as you mentioned, 23, 24, at the end of the Biden administration, one could argue the US-Pakistan relationship was sort of at its lowest point in recent history. But for Pakistan, that has been part of its history in terms of its relationship with Washington. Whenever there's a crisis, it's often that Pakistan is able to leverage that crisis for improvements in the relationship. And so this is not isolated to just the Iran conflict. I would argue since last spring, since the conflict between India and Pakistan with Operation Sindoor and Bunyan Marsus, you saw that US Pakistan relations have been warming, that General Munir has put forth more effort in developing a personal relationship with President Trump that bypasses sort of the traditional State Department architecture. And this really helped Pakistan, sort of pinch hit in the right moment. It was already positioned with warming relations with Washington, a direct channel to the Trump administration where it could offer its services. And at the same time, it was well positioned to do so, right? So as Dan mentioned, it's geography, but I would argue that Pakistan is the country that everyone is willing to talk to in this moment, right? So the GCC countries, Saudi Arabia, Iran, everybody is willing to talk to Pakistan. Pakistan has the diplomatic wherewithal to actually do this. Between the military and its bureaucracy, it has in the past, whether we think about the Nixon era, during the Afghanistan war, a lot of our secret Taliban talks, Pakistan actually does have some capacity to host this. Now, what makes it different? Why not Oman, which was, for example, during the Obama administration, the original channel for the JCPOA talks? I think right now, all the Gulf countries are so acutely affected by this war and the closing of the Strait of Hormuz. Pakistan is close enough, but just removed enough to actually be right there and mediating the talks. That being said, I don't think the Trump administration sees these talks as fundamentally changing. It's not that it changes the US-Pakistan relationship in a strategic way. It is, we're not looking at a strategic recalibration of the relationship, but I think it's leaning on Islamabad because the crisis demands it, and that General Munir and Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif can offer President Trump what he needs in this moment. So I wouldn't necessarily say, they are expending a lot of domestic political capital, because I think domestic mood in Pakistan is really on the side of Iran in a lot of ways, obviously in the Shia minority, but also with the Sunni majority. I think Pakistan has been here before. It knows how to manage this, and it's going to use what it can to improve its standing with Washington in these talks.
No, thanks for that, Tamanna. From what I pick up is transactional more than strategic. And you touched on Field Marshal Munir, and this obviously that's the elephant in the room in this conversation. And I want to, as Dan said, unpack some of that. And I want to come to Michael because Michael, I always say it's been a minute, and you spent many of those minutes of your professional career tracking Pakistan. You've seen it in civilian government and military attire, and this sort of civil relations and the complexity of it. Really, many people say this true talks between US and Iran are dead. You posted the opposite on X, not to hold you to it, but I want you to kind of explain it a little more, stating that the Iranians could easily return to Pakistan, so could envoys Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner. You said both sides seek off ramps and it's just end to the war. How are both sides looking at this right now? Because many describe this as a mutually hurting stalemate, and that means just the globe is affected overall. And Pakistan, of course, has important stakes, as Tamanna and Dan touched on as well. There's a border with Iran, which, of course, in the Pakistan context of its complexity with Afghanistan, India does not get talked about half as much. The border disputes, a Shia population, even though it's predominantly Sunni. So there's a big sectarian aspect also internally that Pakistan worries about. And of course, the close ally of Saudi Arabia. And as Dan touched on, the defense pact signed, I think, September 2025. So the kingdom has been also hit by Iranian strikes, more targeted at US bases. So Pakistan intermediary role is also, it behooves Islamabad to kind of get this sorted out sooner than later, right?
Yeah, thanks, Akshobh, for having me. Great to be here with my co-panelists. So to the first part of your question about my ex post, after became clear that Kushner and Witkoff were not going to go to Pakistan, there was a number of commentators that were saying, "Well, peace is dead. The war is going to be back on soon." And my point is that that's not the case at all. I mean, this is a long game playing out between two countries, two rivals, the U.S. and Iran, that are deeply hostile to each other and deeply mistrustful of each other and have been for a long time. You're not going to have a peace very quickly, right? They're not going to make things easy for each other. So, it seems like the U.S. and Iran are playing a game of chicken right now, hoping that the other side blinks first in terms of the U.S. Pushing with this naval blockade, hoping that prompts Iran to give in, whereas Iran, of course, has been taking the position it has on the Strait of Hormuz, hoping that that'll prompt the U.S. to relent. So both sides, they don't want to concede anything, and it really comes down to who blinks first. But my broader point is that yes, both the Americans and the Iranians in my view, are very much open to talks, and just to take the U.S. side. The Trump administration, including the president, I'm sure recognizes the potential domestic political cost of not getting out of this war. Whether you're talking about the rising energy prices or the fact that the president had promised his base that there would not be any new military adventures. If you look at recent surveys, including a CNN one some weeks ago, the war is quite unpopular in the U.S. So that was my point on that front. Now, in terms of Pakistan and its role as a mediator, we could talk about the geopolitical incentives for Pakistan to play that role, but I think you laid out very well something very important, that Pakistan has a very simple reason for wanting to be playing the role that it has, and that is it has a very strong interest in the war coming to an end. I've said on a number of occasions that Pakistan might be more vulnerable to the effects of the conflict than any other country outside of the Middle East, right? You cited many of the reasons. It borders Iran. It has a significant Shia population, one of the largest Shia populations outside of the Middle East. Pakistan is particularly dependent on hydrocarbon imports from the Middle East. Pakistan has a large number of expatriates living in the region, particularly in the GCC states. And then, of course, indeed, there's the mutual defense pact with the Saudis. And my view is that Pakistan does not want to get dragged into this war. So Pakistan would not want to be in a position where it would have to make a decision about whether it invokes that pact to help the Saudis. And if the war continues, if the Saudis get hit, as they have been to this point, that could put pressure on Pakistan. It would not seek that pressure. So bottom line is, I think that in addition to geopolitical considerations, Pakistan has simply wanted to do everything that it can to help move the needle forward toward a de-escalation and ending the war. So in terms of the specific role Pakistan has played, I think early on it was serving the role of a go-between. It was playing an intermediary role. It was helping with peace facilitation efforts. It was leveraging the friendships that it has, whether you're talking about some of the GCC states or Turkey or later China to try to build a consensus or build a plan for peace. But things changed once the Americans and the Iranians came to Pakistan, to Islamabad for that initial round of talks. And at one point during those negotiations, you had three-way talks. Pakistan, and specifically Asim Munir, was at the table with the Iranians and the Americans trying to broker some type of deal. Of course, it didn't work out, but it was taking place. Final point I'll make is that I think Pakistan does have limitations in terms of how much it can do as a mediator, as opposed to being a facilitator. It's much more difficult, I would argue. It's much more ambitious to be a mediator. In this case, the challenge for Pakistan is that it has only limited leverage over Iran. So its capacity to sway Iranian leadership, I think, is limited. When it comes to the US, as we've heard from Dan and Tamanna, that relationship has really grown. And, the White House, and including the president, appears to genuinely, I don't want to say trust the Pakistanis or something close to that. There's a strong comfort level in the White House for the role that Pakistan has played. But with Iran, it's different. The Iran-Pakistan relationship is not a deep, warm relationship. It's a friendly relationship for sure, but there's some issues there. Whether you're talking about the Pakistan-Saudi Arabia alliance, or issues along the border, concerns about cross-border violence, which prompted a brief war between Pakistan and Iran just over 2 years ago. So this is why I think Pakistan, or one of the reasons why Pakistan's foreign minister went to Beijing several weeks ago, that resulted in a joint proposal for peace. And that, in my view, was a signal from Beijing that it had bought into this Pakistan process on peace. And I think Pakistan has acknowledged that it needs China's buy-in to ensure that the Iranians would be more willing to accept Pakistan's role as a mediator. And the other risk that Pakistan faces as a mediator is that Iran, if it's not already feeling this way, could come to feel that Pakistan is simply too close to the United States, right? It was able to convince the Iranians that Pakistan is not in the Saudi camp, but I think it has not yet fully convinced the Iranians, even if indirectly, that it is not in the US camp. But, every time President Trump praises the Pakistanis and he talks about his favorite field marshal and all of that, that might, I would, cause some unease in Tehran.
Yeah. Speaking of causing unease, Dan, that we got to get to the New Delhi perspective, really, because many in India are sort of flummoxed as to, and maybe, individual commentators, neutral commentators are saying that why isn't New Delhi playing a more central role in the negotiation? Given India actually shares close ties with all the major actors involved, right? There's a historic strategic partnership in the last 25 years or 30 years between US and India. India, of course, is the strategic autonomy has been carefully adroit diplomacy for some. It has good relations with Israel and Iran. Of course, pre-2019, Iran served India's energy needs and Israel serves India's defense needs. So, perhaps to be asked in the beginning of the webinar, is Islamabad's risk appetite heavier than New Delhi's right now to step into, playing a central mediator role?
It's a great question, and I want to get to it. But I did want to pick up on something. So Michael was talking about rightly about some of the limitations that Pakistan has as a mediator, and I agree with all of that. But if we step back a little bit, I would argue, or maybe add, that the success or failure of this process isn't based on Pakistan. So Pakistan has put itself in a meaningful position, has played a role that is important to it, and as Michael correctly identified, has to thread some challenging needles in terms of its relations with Iran, with the United States, and even, I agree, with China. And that's an important drama from a Pakistani perspective. But in terms of whether this war is going to be ended soon or later, this is a US-Iran story and to some extent an Israel story. And that's where I would place the bulk of the drama and the strategic framing of the questions. And so we may get to this, but Trump wants to use Pakistan to the extent that it's useful, but is also saying that he's willing to have conversations by phone or otherwise. So I think it's important to keep an eye on where the meaningful strategic action actually and decisions really are. Pakistan is a player, but not the central player. Okay, That's just a general point. Why not India? I know this is a question being asked in India by a number of people. I have thought about it. I will go back probably over 20 years now to one of the first visits to India when I remember a senior Indian diplomat suggesting to me as a very junior American working at the State Department that if we ever wanted to actually have a deal with Iran, India was perfectly placed to make that happen if we ever wanted to make progress. And why wouldn't we see India as a natural interlocutor for dealings with Iran? And there's a logic to that. And in many ways, that logic holds to this day. And to my eye, it is a sign of how upside down the world is right now, that Pakistan has found itself to be more important and useful to Washington than India has. This is just a part of a broader storyline that all of us have been following, the extent to which what was up is down and what was down is up. And that very much applies to Washington's perspective of Pakistan and India. India was up, is now down in many ways. Pakistan was down, is now up. I apologize. Let me just grab that.
Post-20 COVID
I'm
world.
very sorry. Yeah, this is a problem I didn't resolve before. Anyway, so this is India could play this role and might have played this role in what I would consider to be kind of a normal universe, but we're not there right now. India does lack on the security and geography side of things, where Pakistan has kind of a natural position. India doesn't have that. But you asked about risk aversion. And here I do think that India has shown itself to be pretty risk averse as a diplomatic player. It has wanted to be involved and show leadership in certain ways, but has steered clear of the thorniest political problems, geopolitical problems in the world well before this as well. So, say Russia, Ukraine has not wanted to push itself into the middle of that, even when you could say that India might have played an important role in that conflict and diplomacy on that conflict as well. I had been thinking about ways that India might do more on that. India chose not to. And the question is why? And some of it may be a certain desire to avoid risk. I would say also there's some wisdom here. And again, this comes back to the world being upside down. These are thorny issues where neither India or Pakistan has the wherewithal to resolve them itself. And recognizing that, India appreciates, and I think Indian leaders appreciate all of the things that could go wrong and all of the ways that its kind of carefully crafted balancing act, in this case in the Middle East, could be threatened by injecting itself into that process more directly. And I think you mentioned earlier something about the India-Saudi relationship. India had invested and has invested for well over a decade in improving that, working on things like the India-Middle East Economic Corridor, India-Middle East-Europe Economic Corridor, or IMEC. India wants to play a kind of a variegated role, have good ties with Israel, with Saudi, even with Iran, with the United States, with just about everyone. And has worked really hard to try to make that happen. And so as Indian diplomats and leaders look at this conflict, I think they'd like the conflict to go away. I know they would just as much, if not more, than Pakistan. But I think they also appreciate that they're in a tough spot. Last point would be, because, again, of the world being upside down, India simply doesn't have that position with this White House, with this Trump administration that Pakistan, as we've already discussed, enjoys. That's bizarre. That's not anticipated, but that's the reality. And so therefore they're not on speed dial in the way that Asim Munir is. Who knows if that'll last, but that's certainly been the case over the past year.
Well, I think that alludes to Tamanna's point of a transactional more than strategic. The US India partnership was strategic, whereas this relationship seems more transactional and fair weather friends, perhaps. And Dan, as you said, what's up is down. So trying to find the method, the madness is a very Sisyphean task. So I do apologize for trying to have you three dissect the state of the world we're in. Tamanna, of course, the economic ramifications are far, far central. While we put our geopolitical and historic lens on, we are currently living in the present crisis of, the economic toll, energy crisis, the food prices going up, inflationary crisis, especially affecting South Asia. We always have this onion index in India, when prices go up as well. And you're seeing what's happening in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka. We've seen the images, the stories of shortages, the impact on livelihoods, weddings sometimes being postponed, hotels reducing their buffet spread. And we saw some of this also when the Russia-Ukraine war broke out 4 years ago, the food prices and, the supply chain risks that we're facing, right? This prolonged energy crisis is going to affect economy substantially, even here in the US, right? Is this war is headed to a stalemate, and we're talking about the rising costs as well. How do you kind of see the outlook for India's economic development prospect? Because we just had the World Bank and IMF meetings. The IMF projected India's economy to grow over 6% this year. So India still remains sanguine in a very geopolitical, turbulent world and economic headwinds. But, I'm making you wear your economist South Asia hat here, Tamanna. What's the outlook for India, given the energy crisis?
Yeah, thanks so much. I would just, before I answer the economic question, just add a two-finger to Dan's point of why not India. And I think, of course, adding on to what Dan said, I would note that the deepening India relationship with Israel had already created, India has called a special strategic partnership with Israel. And that really has strained its relationship with Iran in some ways. And so it makes it more complicated for it to play a role. So I wouldn't want to forget that point. But moving to the economic thing, Michael mentioned that Pakistan is particularly vulnerable. I would argue that all of South Asia is particularly vulnerable. Look, all of the South Asian countries, India being probably the most robust in its ability to deal with all of this economic shock, but you're seeing it in Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, definitely Pakistan. Remittances are a huge part of GDP of all of these nations. All of those migrant workers are, based in GCC countries. And so this crisis, the longer it goes on, the more uncertainty that is affected. But more than that, supply chains, and specifically energy supply chains, as you mentioned, there is no other path. I mean, I think India, something like 50% of its energy imports come through the Strait of Hormuz. I mean, it's a significant number. So what are we saying? The IMF projection that you noted, the 6%, was before the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, right? And so now economists are saying that this adjustment might be down a whole percentage point to around 5%, which is significant. I think India is an economy that's big enough that it could probably withstand that, but coupled with what we're probably going to see 1 to 1.5% inflation increase. And when it comes to things, you mentioned the piyaz, the onion index, I mean, it's real. That's what leads to domestic political problems before state elections, energy prices and food prices. That inflation hits the average Indian, and it will be very significant for this Modi government. It's a real government, governance risk. We're already seeing rupee breach 94 to $1 in March. And the Nifty fell 10%. So these are not abstract numbers. This is a real political problem for the Modi government, but also real economic pain for the Indian consumer. So what has India done? I think the immediate response was increased purchases of Russian oil. They have gotten more sanction waivers on that, which has been to India's benefit. So operationally, it's good, but it's deeply, I think, uncomfortable diplomatically. If you look at the trade deal framework that was unveiled in February with the US, part of that was to move away from Russian oil, right? And India is going in the opposite direction because of this crisis. So it's going to be pretty interesting. India is also reviving its Iranian, its Venezuelan, other supply lines. It's trying to think out of the box. But none of that is, comfortable when operationally you really need that Strait of Hormuz for so much crude, for LNG, for so many things. I want to touch on the US-India trade relationship. It was, the US-India relationship was already under strain. This February framework was supposed to result in, be the big good news story for the Indian economy. And really, this Iran conflict has put a damper on that. We haven't gotten to a final deal. In the middle of that, India paid its last installment on Chabahar deep sea port, and the US did not renew the sanctions waiver that expired in April 26. So I think that just adds more pain to this. I would give you one good news story in the economy is India's tilt towards renewable energy. So that is actually more encouraging than the current crisis suggests. India is now the third largest solar market in the world, with installed renewable capacity is something approaching 200 gigawatts, if I'm not incorrect. But its ambitious target is about 500 gigawatts of non-fossil fuel capacity by 2030. And that is great. This crisis actually helps the political winds in India to focus on that. Now, what are the problems? I think the consumers that need energy are growing much faster than the ability to bring on this renewable energy. And then secondly, you have a real supply chain risk, and that so much of your basic material for, solar energy comes through China. So while that's a good news story, hopefully India can continue to focus on the grid infrastructure and bringing on more gigawatts in terms of renewable.
No, yeah, thanks for that, Tamanna. And yeah, that is an important caveat given the forecast was before the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. And it's such a metaphor right now with onion prices as well, because that pungent sense is what we're trying to get from the geopolitical world right now, trying to make this sense of what's down is up, as Dan kind of mentioned. And I wanted to unpack that with you, Michael. And as a good caveat for the audience, as we reach the halfway mark, to put some questions in, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. Michael, there's a lot of these analogies in the last decade and a half, maybe 2 decades, where we talk about the US-China strategic rivalry and inadvertently likened to a new Cold War, right? I mean, and I think the biggest fallacy about that analogy is the USSR was never fully integrated into the mainstream economy. I think some people say it was 2% of the global economy, barely that, And whereas China is, of course, an economic behemoth and almost if forecasts, I believe, could at some point dislodge the US from the totem pole. But on that context, this diplomatic moment for Pakistan's lens, is it also wrong to compare it towards this Nixon-Kissinger moment, the China 1971 moment when President Yahya Khan played a crucial part in the back channels? And of course, as the US-India relationship has grown, the one nadir in history was, of course, the Nixon-Indira Gandhi moment as well. And, that's sort of where, we see the Pakistan-China angle play a part as well. So why is it right or perhaps wrong to compare this Pakistan diplomatic moment to a 1971 Yahya Khan Nixon Kissinger moment?
Yeah, I think it's definitely wrong. It's the wrong analogy. And as we've seen the last few months play out, and as Pakistan has taken on an increasingly prominent role in the peace facilitation efforts, we've seen a fair amount of commentary that's essentially conveyed a sense of surprise that Pakistan has been able to do what it has, and many Pakistanis have taken offense to that, and understandably so, I think. And and a number of them have said, "Well, look, there is a precedent for Pakistan having played this type of role before, and indeed, one of the examples cited is 71." And Pakistan's efforts to help facilitate U.S.-China normalization. But these are just apples and oranges, right? Because that was diplomatic outreach. It was not crisis intervention. There was just not nearly as much at stake. I would argue that what Pakistan has been trying to do now is much more ambitious. And another example of a precedent that many in Pakistan, and not just many in Pakistan, but many observers would give for Pakistan playing this role would be more recently at the end of the war in Afghanistan, when Pakistan helped bring the Taliban to the table to negotiate with the US. I would argue that also is not a fair analogy. What Pakistan was doing back then was really a light lift. And just, to provide some context, Imran Khan, prime minister at the time, was invited by President Trump during his first term to come to the White House. It was not because he wanted to become best friends with Imran Khan. It's because he wanted to convey a message to Pakistan that, look, we want you to use your relationship and connections to the Taliban to help bring them to the table so that we can begin negotiations. And it was very easy to do, just because, at the end of the day, both the Americans and the Taliban were prepared to talk to each other. They wanted to talk to each other because the ultimate ultimate goal was to get to an arrangement that it would entail U.S. forces to leave peacefully without getting shot at. And of course, the Taliban wanted U.S. forces to leave. The Trump administration wanted to leave. So basically what I'm saying is that the ask of Pakistan at that point was actually a very modest one. It was a very easy one. So I would argue that what Pakistan has been doing or trying to do with this mediation is very ambitious. I think more ambitious than anything it's ever tried to do in the context of serving as a mediator. Just a few brief follow-ups to the comments that Dan and Tamanna had made before. First, on the issue of India's role in negotiations, I would agree with what both of them said. I think the Israel factor that Tamanna cited is critical in this regard. But I would just say more broadly, we need to remember that it's been some time that India has not had a terribly good relationship with Iran. I mean, you can go back to when India scaled down significantly its energy imports from Iran, and then you could, look at some other things that have played out more recently, such as the fact that Chabahar just has not been able to take off. And then if you look at the case of that Iranian ship being sunk after having participated in military exercises in India, that would not have been something that would have gone down well in Iran. And then, of course, as we've been discussing, India's relationship with the U.S. has taken a surprisingly downward turn. So I think that's one reason why we should not be surprised that India wouldn't be involved in these facilitation and mediation efforts because it doesn't have the best of relations with the Americans and the Iranians right now. And the other factor I'd cite here is that I think India tends to take more of a cautious diplomatic approach compared to Pakistan, among others, when it comes to these types of scenarios. My sense is that Indian officials would not want to proactively pitch New Delhi as a mediator unless directly asked to play that role by the belligerents. And clearly that has not happened in this case. And this was a point of discussion in soon after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, when there was a view that many, including myself, shared that India potentially could have been a useful mediator there because of its special relationship with Russia and with the friendly relationship that it's had with Ukraine. But we all know that Prime Minister Modi several times very publicly called for an end to the war. This is not an era of war thing became a bit of a mantra, but there was no direct mediation. And I think I've outlined why I think that to be the case. Final point, on the issue of vulnerability, getting at what Tamanna said, I agree completely that the entire region, not just Pakistan, is incredibly vulnerable to the conflict effects. My point, I was speaking specifically about vulnerability to the security or destabilization effects of the war. I mean, Pakistan borders Iran. Of course, Afghanistan borders Iran as well. We can't forget about that. But I think that economically, certainly, you could look at a pattern of across the entire SARC region of significant levels of hurt coming from, the energy security impacts and broader economic impacts. But when it comes to the risk of conflict spillover and things like that, that's where I think Pakistan and potentially Afghanistan are especially vulnerable.
No, absolutely there, Michael. I mean, I want, and I think that's a fair point about the vulnerabilities of Pakistan because it behooves on Pakistan as well, given what their economic outlook looks like. Dan, I wanted to get to something you mentioned a little bit. We obviously the elephant in the room factor here. We touched on a little bit about Asim Munir, and not to get into a little biographical aspect of it, but I'm just curious right now because we were reading reports this week about how Axios reported that several U.S. officials are worried about a protracted frozen conflict, no war, no deal. And of course, we've touched on the economic ramifications with energy prices, and this could also heed some political warning signs ahead of the midterms coming up, because that's obviously a very harbinger of where the country is at this point in time. And perhaps maybe it behooved the administration to look at other routes of mediation or quicker fix. So this is where we've seen the role of Asim Munir sort of come on a little more. I mean, he sort of became a little more prominent in the world stage last year after the conflict with India, Operation Sindoor. It's only the second time in Pakistan's history there's been a field marshal since Ayub Khan in the 50s, the first military dictator that back then. And we know President Trump prefers a direct engagement over this larger multilateral diplomatic setups, which we've seen with other which his predecessors. Is that sort of one of the reasons why Munir's presence on the world stage has been accentuated, just sort of just direct little transactional thing? And of course, people talk about business dealings and crypto aspects. So what's the, again, method in the madness here?
Sure. Lots of good questions there. So let's talk about Asim Munir for a little bit. One word that comes to mind is a word that was coined by then President George W. Bush, misunderestimated. So I would say Asim Munir is one of the most misunderestimated characters on the world stage. I certainly misunderestimated him.
Uh-oh.
Are you there? Looks like everybody's here but Akshobh.
It means you're in charge now, Dan.
Shall we continue?
Yeah, Daniel, keep on speaking.
Okay, I'll keep going. So he's a misunderestimated character on the world stage. Um, and that means that, just as I said before, the world is upside down. His position, which initially, when he first came to power, looked kind of tenuous. He looked like he might be in trouble. Pakistan was facing all kinds of challenges. He now appears to have consolidated his role politically. That is, he's got a lot of legitimacy, particularly after the conflict with India in last May. The economy kind of perked up a bit, or at least settled from a kind of a near crisis period. And he's taken a hard line against Afghanistan, which may or may not pay dividends, but it also reveals, I think, a sense of a certain kind of confidence. So he's a confident character at a time when I don't expect that the rest of the world anticipated that of him. And it is undeniable that he wants to be indispensable for the United States. So he wants to make himself useful. That's been very clear. One of the core goals of the Pakistani state after the Biden administration left was to make itself useful and to not find itself in a situation where they found themselves for about the 4 years of the Biden administration, which was effectively left out and isolated as Washington took more of an India first tilt in the region. But more than that, as they effectively put Pakistan in the doghouse. So they wanted to escape from that. Both for political reasons, this is useful for Asim Munir to show again to his own people that he can get stuff in the world, including from Washington, which is useful to him politically and personally in terms of his personal place in the political setup there. But it's also useful strategically because it puts Pakistan back on the map, makes Pakistan relevant, and that is not just this war in Iran, but a broader scheme to make Pakistan relevant geopolitically in West Asia or the Middle East. And that predated this Iran war, goes back certainly to conversations about putting troops or peacekeepers in Gaza, being part of the board of peace, and so on. So there's a lot that he tried to do to make Pakistan useful again. He's also doing more. Michael got to this in his characterization of the talks. The talks themselves could have been a situation, you could even imagine what we've seen before historically in US-Iran talks, things like proximity talks, where you have the two delegations sitting in different rooms. There's some other third party shuttling in between them, effectively just carrying messages in between the two. That is not this. This is much more including kind of arm twisting or efforts to demonstrate a degree of leverage that Pakistan has, either through providing some kinds of security guarantees to the Saudis in terms of positioning military equipment in the kingdom, showing the Saudis that they can be helpful, and some kinds of security guarantees to Iran narrowly to their delegations visiting for talks, but also coercive, at least implicit threats to Iran that this conflict could get worse if Iran doesn't come to the table and stay at the table. So he's definitely doing more there. But let me conclude by making a point that's similar to what I already said before, which is he wants to make himself indispensable. But Pakistan and Asim Munir will never be indispensable in a world in which this White House and the Trump administration have found it, I don't know about easy, but have taken the step of dispensing with just about anyone and anything at any time when they choose. And this has included US allies and partners. In other words, Washington can flip upside down. And if Asim Munir doesn't appreciate that, again, that is, flip upside down, if they don't appreciate that, then they haven't been paying close attention. I happen to believe they do appreciate that and that they're watching very closely and that every day they're thinking, how can we make sure that that doesn't happen? And working very hard to keep effectively on side with the White House, which further makes them attractive to President Trump and those around him.
Okay.
I think we've lost Akshobh.
I think we've
Yep.
lost Akshobh, but
Yeah, well, no, I'm back
oh,
again.
you're back.
I apologize for the brief tech snafu. I think, yeah, the irony of critical emerging technology, we still have Zoom problems. But in case that happened, please feel free to kind of continue the conversation without me. You're the experts. Tamanna, as I do mention, about the Indo-Pacific, the Strait of Hormuz has become
Okay, I think we've lost Akshobh again.
Yeah.
I can,
Tamanna, you want to continue speaking?
yeah,
Your take
sure.
on
I
that?
think he's going to ask me about, because of the Hormuz crisis, are there other relevant trade
I'm
routes?
back.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, it's just about the Strait of Hormuz. The Strait of Hormuz is absolutely, talk about vital choke points. We talk about supply chains and what this means for South Asia vulnerability, given the energy that's kind of energy so reliant on one part. So does this behoove on South Asian economies to diversify to other parts, like the Strait of Malacca, perhaps, and a need to reinvigorate the IMEC corridor, road, rails, and port infrastructure, given that, there's a need to move away from one choke point. And what does it mean for, alternates to Gulf oil, US and Canadian oil, perhaps? So let's throw in the Venezuela aspect too.
Yeah, no, thanks. That's a great question. A two finger on the Munir question. I would agree with Dan. I think one of the things in terms of Asa Munir's growing confidence, there may be critics within Pakistan of the civilian military balance, but one thing Asa Munir has been able to do is actually be in a strong partnership with his civilian government. So while he's going to Iran, he's sending Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif to other countries, he's using his strong diplomats. He is able to build sort of a consensus within all the different parts of Pakistan state to actually carry out these things. You saw he sent the interior minister, who is, probably the most senior civilian Shia in the government, Minister Naqvi, to Iran. And it's not that they were talking about interior ministry things, but it's sort of a goodwill gesture. So he's understanding how to use the different parts of the Pakistani state. And I think that is, again, a mark of confidence, as Dan said. So, but moving on to the Strait of Hormuz, I think that's a great question. I'm sure every country, no more than, I mean, of course, India, but every country in South Asia would love to have alternative energy pathways. But the reality is how viable are these, right? You raise the Strait of Malacca, and that's the most immediately referenced one that everyone says, but that's really an alternative for East Asian trade. That's not really a solution for the South Asian Gulf oil dependency, right? So for all of these countries in South Asia, the fundamental problem is that the vast majority of their oil comes from the Gulf, and there's no route, a real route from the Gulf to South Asia that doesn't involve some exposure to Iran. And Malacca might be a Pacific choke point, but it doesn't really solve their Arabian Sea problem. So let's talk about the most shovel-ready, I would say, route. That's actually the International North-South Transport Corridor. This is a multimodal route linking India to Russia and Central Asia via Iran. So this is the most developed, this is where the most sort of groundwork has actually been done as an alternative to Gulf-dependent supply. But it's effectively suspended right now because it goes through Iran. So it's the most politically constrained, even though it's the most, close to being viable. And even in the future, if Iran does allow it, we don't know where US sanctions policy will be and whether or not it would allow that to go forward. So what about IMEC? Dan has written quite a bit on IMEC. I think the India, Middle East, Europe corridor, quite a mouthful, was announced at the G20 in New Delhi in 2023. And it's the most ambitious vision, right? As you said, it's multimodal. It goes through all of these countries, through Saudi Arabia, UAE, Israel, goes to Europe. But really, it has barely broken ground. So it is so far from being viable. And now with both the conflict, surrounding Israel and Gaza, Israel and Lebanon, and then Iran, UAE, Saudi, all of these countries are not at a place right now where you are actually building out IMEC. I think IMEC is a story that if it comes to fruition, if we keep having political will behind it, it'll be 2028, 2030 at the earliest before you actually see anything. So it's not really viable for this crisis. Now, US, Canada, Venezuela, you mentioned them all as alternatives. I think India is really trying hard on the diversification. We're seeing US and Canadian LNG coming in more and more to South Asia. India, Bangladesh, Pakistan have all signed or are in active discussions to get more of it. It's just logistically constrained. It's far away. It takes time. The long-term supply is hampered by terminal capacity, regasification. There's a lot of problems here. And then Venezuela oil is still sanctioned. Let's not forget about that. So India has quietly been purchasing it, and the US is okay with that, but we don't know if that's enough to actually solve their Gulf problem. And last, we talked about renewables. Pace is the problem here. Pace is the demand is much out bigger than the pace of actually bringing on renewables. So the honest bottom line is that in the near term around this crisis, South Asia can't diversify away from the Gulf. But what it really needs to do is build strategic reserve capacity. That's what we're seeing China have that has helped China weather much of this storm, right? So it needs pipeline redundancy, it needs supplier diversity. All of these things require money and require political heft. And that's the challenge. Will India and other South Asian countries be able, in a constrained fiscal environment, be able to dedicate themselves to that diversification, that resilience, reserve capacity once the acute crisis has passed? I hope so, but unfortunately, if the past is prologue, that's not usually the case.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, the push for renewables, as you touched on, Tamanna. I wanted to ask you as well, Michael, and I read your South Asia Brief on Foreign Policy very religiously, and your recent one touched on, I think, and National Security Advisor Ajit Doval traveling to Abu Dhabi to meet with the Emirati president over the weekend, and this trip was sort of Delhi's highest level engagement with Gulf countries amid the war. So it just shows energy security is not just confined to petroleum ministry, because if it's going up to the NSA level, and we forget, or we reminded rather, in the Biden administration, the NSA level was dealing with things like ISET, now called the US-India Trust. So when it goes to that level, and given that NSA Doe is a very close interlocutor of Prime Minister Modi, it shows where New Delhi is thinking about this crisis, right?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for reading the South Asia brief, and especially religiously. I appreciate that. So, no, this is an important point, and I think it actually ties into Tamanna's comments about renewables in India. So just to step back for a second, as we all know, the India-UAE relationship is really going places, and it has been for quite some time. Earlier this year, they announced plans to work toward a strategic defense partnership. And I'd argue that this relationship has been building for some time, going back to the decision on India's part to pivot away from Iranian energy imports, and then to focus more on building up better energy relationships with Saudi Arabia and other GCC states, including the UAE. And what's particularly interesting, if you look at how India-UAE ties have continued to grow, comes at a moment when the UAE's ties with Pakistan have torpedoed, have really suffered through some significant challenges over the last few months or so. But yeah, I mean, we know what we saw in media reports after this visit that Doval made to Abu Dhabi, is that they discussed energy security considerations. But I think that really reflects the broader energy partnership developing between India and the UAE. I believe that the UAE is India's top source of LPG. And that's pretty significant, given that we know India is going through a major LPG crisis right now. There's more than 300 million households that depend on LPG for cooking fuel, and that's been imperiled by the war. There was an LNG deal signed between India and the UAE earlier this year. But also renewables has increasingly become a bigger part of this relationship. The UAE is committed to helping India increase its solar capacity. The UAE is already investing in several top Indian renewable energy firms. So there's a lot going on there, and it seems sort of ironic and contradictory, because India continues to be one of the biggest coal producing and consuming countries in the world, but at the same time, it has serious objectives when it comes to energy transition, decarbonization, all of that. This is something that the Prime Minister takes very seriously on a personal level. I mean, he was the one that personally announced the new green hydrogen mission several years ago. So that conveys his interest. And, he laid out some very ambitious targets for decarbonization at the UN Climate Summit several years back, and the government in India takes those targets very seriously. So even as it continues to focus on coal in the coming decades, it is taking major steps to try to work toward those decarbonization goals. And obviously, a lot of that relates to doing things at home with domestic energy policy, but I think it also will entail working with its close friends, including friends that it has existing strong energy partnerships with, and trying to make those energy partnerships greener. And I think that the UAE is one example of that.
No, absolutely. And as we kind of get to the business end of the webinar just I wanted to ask this to Tamanna, but I want to kind of put this out there to the broader panel as well.
I can jump in. I don't know if Tamanna, if you wanted to jump on the China bit first, and then I can come in on other stuff.
Yeah, that would be good.
Sure. Sure. I mean, I agree with you. I think we are seeing China exercise amazing strategic patience here. It's been extraordinarily disciplined throughout the conflict. Xi hasn't condemned US strikes. They haven't explicitly publicly sided with Iran. They've kept all their economic relationships with the Gulf states intact, and they've sort of watched as Washington has exhausted military assets or diplomatic bandwidth or fiscal space in Beijing's view. And all while the trade war with Beijing is sort of nominally on hold, right? It's sort of in a tariff truce, if you might. And so this idea that they're biding their time is, and accumulating advantages seems to be the case. Now, what's their behind the scenes role is really interesting. While they're not publicly saying this, and we're not seeing it so much in the Western press, they're not a passive observer of the Iran conflict. They have over $100 billion in existing energy and infrastructure commitments in Iran. They have a 25-year comprehensive strategic partnership signed in 2021. And those commitments really do give Beijing deep economic stakes in Iran's stability, at least in Iran's survival. They don't want an outright defeat of the Iranian state. And it gives them significant leverage over Iran's decision-making publicly, as Beijing has called for restraint. Privately, we're seeing that their credible reports suggest China is telling them not to succumb to US demands and to hold strong. It's also quietly continues to buy Iranian crude through secondary, it's buying them through these elaborate pathways and unmarked ships and all these things that it has developed over a long time. It didn't just start with this. So, they have a whole network of shadow tankers, intermediary buyers, and they've avoided secondary sanctions to a large extent, right? There's the threat Washington has made, but they've largely avoided that. So in some ways, Beijing is coming out pretty much on top, or it's biding its time. But it's also interestingly that it is deepening its economic foothold in Iran this way. A much weaker Iran has much more dependence on Beijing. Similarly, it's strengthening its relationship with Pakistan. So in some ways, China's own connectivity architecture does benefit from this. It also benefits, as I mentioned, from having a strategic reserve of energy. I would say Russia, just to mention Russia really quick, is sort of the above ground version of what China's below the surface role is. So Russia is taking a much more public support of Iran. We saw Iranian Foreign Minister Araghchi this week in St. Petersburg. You asked about the Trump-Xi summit. Now, I'm not going to guess. Anything can happen in this upside down world, but the signals are pretty mixed. I think there's incentives on both sides to hold the meeting. Trump wants a foreign policy whim. I think that is not Iran related, and Xi wants more clarity in this. The tariff truce is sort of very opaque. So I think sanctions relief, tariffs relief would be great if it came from that. But Xi can't be seen as publicly accommodating Trump, especially if the Quad meeting signals, a very anti-China sort of moment, which I'm not guessing it will, but if it does, then Xi may back away.
Dan and Michael, we're almost at the witching hour, so what your closing thoughts on
I'd
that?
love to jump in and just make an observation. Look, for since about 2000, 2001, many American commentators have appreciated that our global challenge geopolitically was China for the United States. and that all of the other things that we've done have been, in a sense, maybe necessary, but often distractions from that challenge. And this Iran war looks like another chapter in that history where every minute that we're spending fighting this conflict is a minute that we are not spending confronting a variety of challenges on the China front. And it's very tangible when it comes to munitions. That's a very obvious and direct way in which our attentions have been distracted and will be depleted, our capacity depleted. But there are other broader issues about where we're spending our time, energy, diplomacy, and where we're able to develop even our technologies on the military side and in other ways, which we can't do the more that we're distracted by yet another war in the Middle East or West Asia. So this is another piece of a long story. There's a happy version, which is somehow we come out of this. We solve the upper Iran problem. We settle the Middle East for the next generation to come. And then we can pivot smartly to the China challenge. And there's an unfortunate and I think more likely prospect, which is we've just found ourselves in another long process that, for better or for worse, is going to be as costly and probably more costly for us in the United States than it is for China. And to Tamanna's point, they'll be looking on from the sidelines and, laughing all the way to the bank.
Michael, laughing all the way to the bank. That's a
Yeah,
key
just
phrase from Dan's comments.
yeah, absolutely. Just very briefly, I think Tamanna made a very important point about the nature of the relationship between China and Iran now. This is what gives China a lot of leverage over Iran, much more leverage than Pakistan has over it. That's why I said earlier in our discussion that it was critical for Pakistan to get China's buy-in to what Pakistan was doing, in order for Pakistan to be taken seriously as a mediator by the Chinese side. And I think it had that. I'd like to think that China has not had nearly as much trouble getting energy imports from Iran during the crisis as many other countries have. And I think that's a reflection, again, of the leverage that China has over Iran and the nature of the ship. Starting with that.
No, absolutely. Dan, Michael, Tamanna, as we touched on this upside down world, we can say it's Stranger Things. To close with a Netflix one there. No, but thank you all so much to unpack the method and the madness. We're in Pakistan, Iran, India, South Asia, Strait of Hormuz, Strait of Malacca, IMAC, all in an hour or less. I mean, it's a very Sisyphean task, and thank you so much. And these are being live streamed on YouTube. So if you missed anything Dan, Tamanna, Michael said, you can go back, revisit the Pearls of Wisdom. We'll have them on for another program. Or what that program is, well, depends on the shifting sands of the Middle East and more. Thank you all so much and enjoy the rest of